Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Luis Anastasio Castro Red Honey Processed Costa Rica from Matteo. And there's the container right there. And Matteo, based out of Gothenburg, Sweden. And this is part 3 of our 24-part KaffeBox Advent Calendar series, and our 4th review of a Matteo coffee. They were featured in our first ever KaffeBox Advent Calendar series back in 2020, and I was a little disappointed to see them absent from last year's calendar, as they did have a couple of my favorite coffees from the 2020 calendar. One thing that is kind of interesting about this coffee is we actually reviewed the white honey processed version of it earlier this year, so it's going to be interesting to see how the red honey turned out. And again, the way that this works is the notes and tasting wheel were made with the V60, and this cup right here was brewed with the Chemex. And unless the roaster or KaffeBox has a recipe, we will opt for our standard recipe, which we did in this case, and that is a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 205 degrees Fahrenheit, 96 degrees Celsius. In terms of roast profile, this one wasn't necessarily overly light, and it didn't have too much development in spite of the fact that it was the honey fermentation processing, so it's very much in line with what you would expect for a Scandinavian coffee. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. First impression, and the cup initially started out somewhat tame with a little bit of a quick finish. And they do have a pear note listed on here, and I think that's kind of what I could attribute it to, because oftentimes I find pears to be maybe a little bit lacking in flavor overall. But the cup did start to improve in terms of vibrancy as it did cool down, as there was a slight bit of fermentiness felt in the red berry sense, and it was at the forefront of the cup. Now, if I recall correctly, they didn't have any sort of red fruit note listed on this coffee, but I typically associate a lot of fermented Costa Rican coffees with some pretty distinct red berry components to it, and that was no exception in this coffee. As the cup continued to cool down, I was definitely able to experience much more of those red fruit characteristics, much more present in a lasting sense as well. So what started out as a more even and quick finish turned out into a more lively and lasting red fruit finish to the cup. At the same time, there were some additional slight stone fruit aspects that were a little bit more akin to me for a apricot as opposed to a peach that they had listed on here. I say that I associate stone fruits with apricot more when they come out in a jammy sense as opposed to the peach, which I typically associate with a more fresh fruit aspect to it. In addition to that, there was a secondary citric brightness to the cup. And we'll finish off discussing the V60 because there was also some slight grainy quality to the cup, which did suggest that there were improvements that could be made with some adjustments. And that's actually a huge deviation from what I experienced with the Chemex, because the Chemex comes out a lot more clean. I was able to get a lot less of the fermenty aspects, while at the same time a little bit more of the stone fruit to it. While still in a slight jammy sense, I could see a lot more of the peach, and interestingly enough, most pronounced characteristic through the Chemex was very much the honeyed sweetness that I was experiencing. So two very different coffees, as a lot of the red fruit traits and aspects did feel toned down through this brew method. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. All right, and 4 level 4s, so let's go through those real quick. The body out of level 4. Yes, this coffee actually had great texture when brewed through the V60, and that's one of the better things I do have to say about this coffee is the V60 has wonderful texture. So if that's an important thing for you, then it did have really nice body to the cup. Finish, level 4. Said early on, the coffee had a quick and even finish, but with a little bit of a cool down, it definitely started to open up. So I definitely justified that at the level 4 mark. Early on in the cup, you could say it's a little bit more quick and even, but towards the end, definitely justified there at that level 4. Sweetness, level 4. Interestingly, whichever brew method you go for, I do think that it's a level 4, but in 2 very different directions. It's more of a red fruit sweetness through the V60, and it's more of a honeyed sweetness through the Chemex. And as a result, I definitely prefer the sweetness that comes from the Chemex. Regardless, it reaches that level 4 mark no matter which brew method you go with. And berry fruit level 4, which again was a little bit more specific to the V60. As the Chemex, I would actually bump the stone fruit up to level 4, and I would bump the berry fruit down maybe to a level 3, maybe even to a level 2, because I get significantly less of that red berry and slight fermenty aspects to the cup. While at the same time, the citrus fruit was consistent regardless of which brew method I brewed it through, as the pear actually honestly goes into the citrus fruit categories, since I can't really find a different spot for it. But yeah, I think that the citrus fruit I will leave there at that level 3 mark, and then the stone fruit, again, kind of adjusted based off whichever brew method you go with. We have a couple of level 3 marks. We'll start with the acidity, which was kind of interesting to me. I definitely thought and expected this to have a lot more acidity, but maybe drinking it after having a Kenyan coffee, the acidity feels a little bit more middle as opposed to something that was a lot more pronounced. Even then, this didn't necessarily have the type of acidity I might have been expecting. Florality, level 3. Yes, and it was in the red direction, and it was slightly herbal, so it definitely reminded me of the hibiscus, which is kind of 3 for 3 at this point in terms of the coffees. But what I found interesting about that is that's maybe the thing I remember the most from the white honey processed version of this coffee, is that definitely had a fair bit of those hibiscus-like traits to it. Last thing we probably need to discuss is the cleanliness at that level 3 mark. It's cleaner through the Chemex. I could probably justify it at the level 4 mark of the Chemex, but obviously the things that kind of kept it at the lower mark was the slight grainy quality and the fermented qualities. So that's why I feel like with some adjustments I could definitely have that bumped up. But the coffees were very different based off of those brew methods, and I think that's maybe the main point I'm trying to get across with this review, is 2 very different coffees, one of which I was a big fan of, one of which I didn't necessarily like as much as anticipated. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. So I honestly, again, it kind of depends on which way you go with it. So if you go with the V60, I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan. And if you go with the Chemex, then I quite enjoyed it. One of my favorite coffees from the Advent calendar to this point. I would say that the honey sweetness is a nice selling point to me. The clarity obviously going to be the selling point to me. And as somebody that hasn't necessarily loved the red berries and fermenting qualities, then that's why the V60 wasn't necessarily my favorite for this one. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, and again, that makes it kind of an interesting recommend because it depends on what you're looking for, and having this coffee be a little bit more versatile offers itself to a couple more people. So if you are looking for something that has a lot of those red fruit characteristics while maintaining a lot of body and texture, then this is a great suggestion for you, as it will have those attributes to it with a little bit more depth and complexity and some interesting floral components to it. If you're looking for something a little bit more clean with a little bit more of a different honeyed sweetness, a little bit more of those stone fruit aspects, which is very much my type of coffee, then going with the Chemex on this one, that would make for a nice suggestion as well. I think for the most part, I'll leave this review at that. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Luis Anastasio Castro Red Honey Processed Costa Rica from Matteo. Thank you for watching.